this belief that any child can be anything he or she wants to be if they get the right education and the right opportunities. I don't think anybody actually believes that. It's not a caring and compassionate way to think about children that have very different capacities. But nonetheless, that's the way we run the educational system.
Charles Murray. Just casually drop that name on social media and you'll catch heat from strangers that have never read a single word of his work, but they're positive that he's evil. Murray's a Harvard-trained sociologist who's pumped out reams of careful, data-centric, humane investigations into some of the most important social trends in modern America. What tends to get lost in the hysteria about his work is this: Murray's radical critique of the education system. Murray says our schools are living a fundamental lie. A lie about the nature of human intelligence. A lie fed by people of all political stripes. I want to know more about the lie. So we traveled to his home in small town Maryland to ask him about it. So Dr. Murray, what is IQ?
IQ is a kind of mental agility. A quick example. There is a subtest in IQ tests called digits backward, and it consists of reciting backwards a list of numbers like 6, 4, 9, 2, 1. And when I am asked to recite those backwards, I really have to work at it. I have to think and sort of mentally go. There are some people who, when they hear those numbers, can read them off backward from the image that they have in their mind of that. Okay, that's a mental agility. Some people have and other people don't. It's a really good indication of high visual spatial skills. Okay, it's the same as agility in athletics. It doesn't indicate merit. It's not a matter of human worth. It's not virtue. It's not compassion. It's none of those things. It's this capacity that differs across people. And the problem is it's become a capacity, this mental agility, which has acquired enormous economic value over the last century.
In the year 2021, what is the scientific consensus on the determinants of individual IQ?
Genetics is the largest single aspect of it, and the manipulable parts of IQ, meaning the shared environment, don't play much role.
You flat out say education system is built on a lie. What do you mean by that?
It is built on this belief that any child can be anything he or she wants to be if they get the right education and the right opportunities. I don't think anybody actually believes that about their own kids, but it is sort of the thing that people are always saying when they are talking about the improvements in education that can bring all the children above average, as in what's the late lamented "No Child Left Behind." It's a lie. But nonetheless, that's the way we run the educational system, so that if you try to say, you know what, kids have different levels of intellectual ability, and that ought to affect our expectations of them, and it ought to affect the kinds of educations they get. To say that is to be guilty of the bigotry of low expectations. It's not a caring and compassionate way to think about children that have very different capacities.
What is the evidence that we have that this romanticism about the ability to boost cognitive ability in kids through formal education is false?
A lot of it is just simply quantitative, where you have kids who are given IQ tests at the age of 6, and you give them the same IQ tests at the age of 14, and the correlation between their scores are extremely high. Does anybody ever have radically different scores? Yeah, they do. In some cases, it is just a test artifact that they had a headache the day they took the test the first time and they didn't have the second time. But IQ is not perfectly stable over the course of a lifetime. But on average, over large numbers of people, it is. And if the question is not, does IQ ever change, but rather, Do we have programs that will encourage that change and produce it in a significant proportion of the people who get this special program? The answer to that is no. And there have been all sorts of attempts to do exactly that. A lot of the ones that have gotten the most attention are preschool, where they've had very intensive preschool programs for children. And lo and behold, when they leave the program at the age of 5, they have shown big improvements on cognitive test scores. Sometimes. But then they all fade out. So by the time they are 8 or 9, you have a very small residual, pretty much a trivial residual.
Did you follow at all the Varsity Blues scandal, where a bunch of these celebrities in California bribed to get their kids into colleges, right? So basically bribing to pretend that your daughter is a water polo star so she can go to USC, right?
Yep.
Or pretend that she's like Samoan so she can get into Yale, or have someone else take the SAT for her. One of the primary recruitment grounds for that scandal was my old high school in West Los Angeles, which now costs $50,000 a year. Right? I was wanting to run this by you, where a lot of the students at Brentwood, there's a way in which the parents going through this college admissions process are running up against the raw reality of IQ that you diagnose, which is you got the 18-year-old. She lives in a $4 million mansion in Beverly Hills. Her parents spend $50,000 a year at Brentwood. They spent $10,000 on Kaplan test prep, and she just cannot get above a 1200 on the SAT. She cannot. Mm-hmm. So she's not going to Yale. Mm-hmm. They're like running up against this raw reality of what cognitive talent is and how much you can do to actually modify it. And so they tried to find some like end around neurological reality. That's kind of what happened.
Yeah, but something else that happens is that when they get her in there under false pretenses, none of this fairy dust that they want to rub off on her is going to rub off on her. Yeah.
What I would say is they're asking the rhetorical question is, but okay, fine, it's not backed up by the science. But what's the harm in telling every kid you can be anything you want to be if you just study hard enough? Why is Dr. Murray crushing their dreams?
Yeah, you see, the way you have phrased it is exactly the way that most people phrase it.
Right.
And how about instead if we stop couching these dreams in terms of you can have a corner office in the skyscraper and be making $1 million a year. Let's stop phrasing it in terms of lawyers. That's such a wonderful thing to be as a lawyer, really. Is that much fun? And what I'm really saying is that we have taken a limited set of occupations, and these are the ones that these kids are supposed to aspire to. Well, guess what? A whole bunch of kids don't aspire to be those things. They have a knack for machines, and they love fiddling with machines, and they would much rather be working with machines out of high school than going on to college. I'm thinking about the son of a friend we know. Plenty smart enough to go to college. He loves what he's doing. He's getting really, really good at what he's doing. And fortunately, he lives in a family that's not saying to him, no, you got to go to college. But the educational system says that. Politicians say that. They supply loans so that kids who have no business going to college, either because of their abilities or because of their interests, are seduced into going to college, building up huge financial debt, then dropping out. It's a criminal kind of system. Goldman Sachs does not interview at Harvard because it is under any illusion that 4 years of Harvard have prepared these kids for Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs interviews at Harvard because the kids got into Harvard. and that is an indication of them. There's a lot of raw talent there. And once that signal gets noisy, because you no longer have a way of discriminating the most talented academically, Harvard is not going to be nearly as attractive to a lot of employers. By the way, it's already not nearly as attractive to a bunch of employers. The CEO of a very famous company that I will not mention said, "We don't even interview at Princeton, Harvard anymore. We don't want those kids. We're sick of them. We want kids from Southeast Oklahoma State who've worked hard all their lives and share our values, and we're going with them."
But also the strange thing is the odd fetish put on a select group of white-collar professions, particularly in the Tony corridors of private school Los Angeles that I came from. I know a lot of people that ascended and won that hierarchical race, and they don't actually like the jobs. I mean, there's a deeper, foundational misapprehension of what the good life is, and a lot of these, meritocratic, somewhat meritocratic systems that reward high IQ. It's kind of a separate point, but
well, let's talk about that. The number of options that the child of an affluent family is exposed to for a career is in its way as limited as the options that an inner city kid has. I'm not saying the options are the same. I'm saying they're both a very limited set. And for the kids in that affluent upper middle class family, it's probably one of the professions, law, medicine, or business, in which case it's not business, entrepreneurial, venture capital. It's not exciting stuff. It's the boring stuff. And the number of attorneys who are attorneys because it's a good all-purpose degree and because they didn't have the gumption to get out of college after they graduated with their BA are miserable at the age of 39, even though they're pulling down $300,000 a year and should be living the American dream. They are.
They're the winners. They're supposed to be the
They're
winners.
supposed to be the winners, and a lot of them at that time changed their careers. The problem in changing your career when you're 39 is it's kind of hard to become really good in another career where you have to serve an apprenticeship. Right. So yeah, I want to in some way get these privileged kids to understand all the different ways there are of making an exciting living, because there are lots.
But there's a way in which the lack of education and character, or the idea that there could be a thing called the good life that you ought to aim for, is tied into the fact that all these cognitive elites go into essentially spiritually hollow professions like being corporate lawyers, right? Yeah. Those two things are intimately intermingled.
The future of the country depends on how we educate the gifted. And it's not that I want them to run the country. I'm saying that they are going to run the country, whether you want them to or not. And so we better make sure that we accomplish a couple of things with them. One is that they have to be exposed in a rigorous way to ethics, to religion for that matter. They have to be exposed to a lot of history rigorously, because history does in fact teach you all sorts of things about how things can go bad if you don't see what has happened in the past. That's one set of things. Rigor, first, being forced to not do glib papers that they've scribbled down the night before, but master this material. They also have to have it drummed into their heads that this thing called high IQ is a pure, unearned gift. They did not, I don't care whether it's genes or environment, either way, they did not get smart by trying hard. They were born at a moment in history and in a society where this quality had suddenly taken on all sorts of economic value, and they should be down on their knees every night thanking God or whatever for this unearned gift.
Right, and when they're like, well, Charles Murray is talking about intelligence, this is so controversial. Like, how dare you talk about it? What they don't realize is they only think it's controversial because of a baseline assumption of their worldview, which is that intelligence equals moral worth, right?
Yeah.
So they think you must be saying people, if they vary in intelligence, they vary in their worth or their ability to live good lives. And you're like, no. That baseline assumption is what's is what's messed up and morally
And
bankrupt.
everything I've written about intelligence, starting with the bell curve with Dick Herrnstein, has said explicitly, do not confuse IQ with moral worth.
Right.
It's just one of the problems here, I think, is the decline of religiosity. And I'm thinking specifically of Christian theology, which has as its central tenet that God does not judge people by their good works nor by their IQ scores.
Right.
That this is irrelevant to human worth, and it also teaches you to be very humble about your own frailties, your own mistakes, your own sins, and the rest of it.
Right.
There was built into Christians, serious Christians, an understanding, a gut level understanding of that truth about moral worth and IQ just being in separate planets.
Right.
You want your children to understand what is really so great about America. And what is so great about America, you're going to find in a place like Burkittsville or near Charles City much more easily than you're going to find it in Brentwood. And in fact, you won't find it in Brentwood, I submit to you. It's really hard for you to see it there. Because a great deal of what made this country special, which is the functioning of local communities and the interaction of different people to solve problems and all that, that's alive and well out here. It's alive and well in a city the size of Frederick, which is 75,000 people. It's very much a Tocquevillian American world outside of the big megalopolises. I practiced what I preached, or what I believed, which is we moved out to here from Adams Morgan in Washington, D.C., knowing that the local schools were rated as mediocre, not terrible, but because it's so much more important to get to know a wide range of kids and not to grow up with these other kids who've also come from just the same background you have and are socialized in the same way and are so insular.
So is there a God?
I think so, yes.
In what, defined how?
By my wife.
A benevolent intelligence?
Well, let me back off for a minute and say that my wife, who is a very active Quaker, religiously active, spiritually active, not social activism active, has over the last 20 years slowly brought me from a quite firmly agnostic point of view to just seeing too many things that make more sense if there is a God. Literally make more sense in some of the ways that Francis Collins covers in the language of God, and other times where it's really hard to explain how certain things could be otherwise. But it's never as clear, I think, with people of faith. Are there some people who have no doubts, who thoroughly define it? Yeah, sure there are. With me, and I think I share this with my wife too, we anthropomorphize God. It's irresistible to anthropomorphize God. But the fact is that any God worthy of the name is as incomprehensible to us as I am to my dog, more incomprehensible, because my dog has some sense of who I am. My dog doesn't know what I'm doing when I'm running a regression analysis. And the difference between me running a regression analysis, my dog understanding it, is minor compared to any genuine God and what we can perceive.
Do you think that there's an afterlife?
I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of dying that we find out. And I won't go to the wall on it. I will say that my fear of death is very weak. And I think part of the reason it's very weak is that I'm not at all convinced that the lights go out forever. I do not know how to express my relative sense of probabilities at this point. But I have to say I look forward to death with genuine curiosity in that regard. One of the things about getting old that I find interesting and unexpected is how happy a time it's been.
Really?
Yeah, I have. I don't know whether that's a common experience or not, but I think it's fair to say my wife and I have had a very happy marriage for 30 several. We're getting close to 40 years, but we've never been happier than we are now.
Do you know what accounts for that?
No. Happiness in life essentially comes down to two things. The first is find your soulmate. And a good marriage is as good as it gets. And second, find something that you really love to do. And on both of those counts, I have been incredibly blessed.
Would you think about legacy much? Like your legacy?
Not really. And the reason is this. I think back to people who occupied a position either similar to mine or actually much more well-known than mine. Think back to somebody like Walter Lippmann. Early part of the 20th century, or actually the first half of the 20th century, he was probably America's most famous public intellectual. How many people have heard of him now? What did he do? What did he write that has had any lasting effect? You know, I think I have provided some pretty good commentary and analysis of some pretty important things, but they're ephemeral. And the problems that I have been dealing with in my work are not going to be very interesting to people 100 years from now. I have written only one thing, and jointly with my wife, that I'm absolutely confident will still be read 1,000 years from now, and that is Apollo.
Yeah.
Our account of the Apollo program. And I'm confident of that because it is a book that has material about one of the only events of the 20th century that will still be remembered 1,000 years from now.
Yeah.
That this was when human beings first left the earth. And so I think that it may only be a few historians that are reading it, but that I think is going to last.
Huh.
But the rest of it won't.
Man, it all vanishes into history, huh? Everything fades to dust.
Yeah, it's.
That's a bit of a downer.
Well, it's also useful to keep that in mind because it's a proper sense of proportion, you know?
Yeah.
That all of these things, that the most successful people in the world are all going to be forgotten within, okay, you have a General Grant, you're going to be remembered for several hundred years. But so many of the people who occupy huge positions now, sic transit gloria mundi, right?
Yeah.